Welcome back to Fourth Stream. Good to be with you today.
Yes, it
You
is.
looking forward to this?
Yeah.
This is a huge deal when you're talking about warfare. And you think about, Paul talks about weapons for the left hand and for the right. And I think he's talking about the shield of faith and the sword of the Spirit. I'm right-handed, so the sword's in my right hand. But that's one aspect of how we fight. So we're given our faith, and we're given the sword of the Spirit. But there are also other powerful weapons in the fight, and forgiveness is one of those. And one of the misconceptions that we can run into is that other people are our enemies.
Right.
And that's the only issue. The only issue is who's offended us, who's hurt us, our need to forgive them. But there is someone who inspires all of that kind of behavior. And so when I talk about forgiveness being a weapon, I'm talking about primarily a weapon against the work of the adversary. So keep that in mind as we have this pretty extensive conversation, really.
Well, and as we talk about the adversary, I just read something that C.S. Lewis wrote, and he was saying that there's this whole spectrum. On one end, you have people who see demons everywhere.
Right.
And he calls those people superstitious because, well, just obvious. And then
he's British.
Then you have the other.
Actually, he was Scottish.
Then you have the other end of people who don't believe at all, and those are skeptics. And the idea is it's time to move to the middle. We don't want to be superstitious. We don't want to be skeptics. We want to be in line with what the truth is.
Well, and like we've been talking about too, you can't, it's not a matter of superstition. If it is a matter just of superstition, then Jesus was superstitious.
Right.
But Jesus also understood the reality of spiritual warfare, and he led us into that, which is why Matthew 18 is so key, because he's explaining how to disarm the work of the evil one between people.
Yeah, and Jesus's prescription is clear. It's not easy, but it's clear. When I'm hurt by someone, or offended, or whatever it is that makes me uncomfortable, I'm supposed to go to them, because as I do that, it keeps it private. It keeps it from including other people in, aligning with us or aligning with, it keeps strife from happening. But also it gives, if I come to you, it gives you a chance to say, oh, that is not what I meant.
Right.
Or that is, yes, you're right, I did say that, but that is not how I meant it. Or I'm just really sorry.
Which is the amazingly powerful tool in the midst of why Matthew 18 is there, is because if we can understand how somebody is grieved, and if we can respond to them in kind, it's very disarming to the adversary, because then he has nothing between us, because forgiveness really is supposed to be God's gold standard. It's the ultimate in living life and in being free.
It's also, we have heard this a lot over our lives, where someone will say, well, I'm not the only one that feels this way. And just being careful that that's not one of your arguments, because it's a dangerous argument, it's an unfair argument. And it's
a chicken argument.
It's a cheap argument, because it means that you don't have the nerve to just stand on what you have to say and follow through obediently. So now that's not to say that sometimes if I have something going on in my life and you come to me and I can't see it, it doesn't mean, at some point that reputation of myself, that thing about myself is going to be exposed. And so then you might find someone else who says, I've experienced the same thing.
That's called being confirmed by 2 or 3 witnesses.
Yeah, and it's not really that you go out seeking to do that, but things come to light and then you expose it and you take another person. There, it's all in Matthew 18, how that's supposed to be dealt with.
And part of this, the side of that whole dynamic that you're talking about is that the Bible has a lot to say about false witnesses. Just because I don't like somebody or because I've been offended by somebody doesn't mean that everything I feel or everything I think is true. And so to be free to forgive, false witnesses should not be brought into a whole process related to forgiveness.
Right, because God has a whole other series of comments
Yeah.
about false witnesses.
Right, but they do relate to the issue of forgiveness and of keeping clear conscience toward one another, which is why when somebody offends you, you leave your gift at the altar and you go and talk to that person.
Okay, so this was interesting to me. As we started talking about this, there's a parable that I'm always affected by. It's the parable of the king who had a servant. And I'm actually going to read it because I think I'll become convoluted in trying to retell it. But I have always been struck by the end of this, and I'll get to it in a minute. I mean, totally struck. It's such a motivation to me to be sure I'm forgiving, because I don't want to happen to me what happens to the person at the end of this parable. But what really struck me is when I went to look for it, it's right in Matthew 18. How I never noticed that before, that it's right in line with all of this.
What Jesus is teaching about forgiveness.
Hello, I don't know how I missed that. So this is the parable.
I forgive you.
You're an idiot, is that what you're trying to say?
No, I said I forgive you.
So this is the parable that amazes me, and it's out of Matthew 18, right after what we just talked about. And then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? 7 times? Oh, Jesus replied, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. Then he says, therefore, or consequently, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with the servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him millions of dollars. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold, excuse me, along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned to pay the debt.
So this really was a king.
It was
He
a
had
real
that
king.
kind of authority.
Yes. But the man fell down before his master and begged him, please be patient with me. I will pay it off. His master was filled with pity for him. And if you think about Jesus, he had compassion on us. He released us and he forgave us our debt.
Yeah.
Okay, but when this man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. And he grabbed him by the throat and he demanded instant payment.
Scary.
And his fellow servant fell down before him and begged for a little more time. Be patient with me. I will pay it, he pleaded. But his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. See why I couldn't tell this. It's just better to read it.
A lot to it.
So when some of the other servants saw this, they were very upset. They went to the king and told him everything that had happened. They told him, we saw this guy that you forgave, and then we saw him not forgive. So the king called in the man.
So the community had a part in this story. Interesting.
Yes. Then the king called in the man he had forgiven and said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king, and this is what gets me, this is what I find motivating. Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. And what that means for me, how I will end up living if I don't forgive. It doesn't matter how bad the offense against me, I still have to remember that my king forgave me. And that's what my Heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. That is motivating. Mm-hmm. That is motivating.
Parables are really powerful because anybody can understand them, and that's why Jesus spoke in parables often, because every part in this image, whether you live under a king or under a president, you can understand exactly the elements of this, and the clarity that's there regarding forgiveness is huge. I was just thinking as you were talking, and I don't know that we were planning on discussing this, but there's a place in Hebrews chapter 12 it says, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, and no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. Mm-hmm. And what happens is that when forgiveness is not appropriated and when it doesn't happen, then roots of bitterness spring up. And the best way to get somebody from being free is to have roots of bitterness, because roots of bitterness continue to vibrate because they're at the root of who we are.
And they affect other people.
And then not only does the adversary control us, but he begins to control the people who are involved and touched by the roots of bitterness. And if we don't pursue forgiveness, we fall prey to roots of bitterness, and that's part of the teaching. The implications related to a lack of forgiveness are really quite huge.
I was struck by that when Dave and I hadn't been married very long, and we had a son who had to have open heart surgery, and your brother died, and you decided it was a good time for us to move to Menominee. And so it was really hard on me because I was living with near in-laws who I didn't know very well, and I had to leave all my friends. And
fortunately, she had a very sensitive husband through the whole process.
I'm not talking about your part. I'm just talking about what I went through. But just how hard it was on me, because I was kind of mad at you, but you were also my best friend. And I was busy with 3 kids. I had no friends, even though our wonderful friends came up and visited every weekend. So I wasn't really friendless. But I can remember going for walks and just begging God not to let me become a bitter person over this, because I was young, I was 30, and just thinking, oh my gosh, I see bitter women and they're ugly.
It's very unflattering.
And so I used to just go for this walk and march along and just say, I'm not going to be bitter, I'm not going to be bitter, as these stupid flies were, the Wisconsin flies.
They actually were visiting from Minnesota.
Anyway, that's my story on bitterness. But I've always been a little afraid of being bitter because it is so harmful. When you're around someone bitter, you see it show up in one or more of their kids. You just see it. It eats at them all the time.
What did you think about in the middle of this post, we talked a little bit about Proverbs 6, the 6 things the Lord hates. Did you spend any time considering that at all?
Well, I did. I was shocked by, is it the last one?
Yeah.
These are the things that God hates. But really, they're all things that go with unforgiveness, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. And they're wrapped up in our pride, too. The list is haughty eyes, a lying tongue, which is basically somebody bearing false witness.
And haughty eyes go before a fall.
Right. Hands that shed innocent blood when somebody doesn't deserve, which often happens in our world, in our turbulent world. A heart that devises wicked plans. I mean, I can't even think about a time in my life where I sat and thought, this is how I'm going to get even. Because, you know better.
Right.
Because it's not from the heart of God. And feet that run rapidly to evil, a false witness who utters lies, and one who spreads strife among brothers. And I brought that out in the post because those are they all accompany the lack of forgiveness. Those are all actions that come from people, whether you're the one who needs forgiveness or the one who is giving forgiveness, or wherever you fit into the story. All of those things are things that the adversary brings in to confuse the issue.
There was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that was when Jesus says to someone, and you're so much better at telling this in a moving way, when he says, she who has been forgiven much loves much. If you feel like you've been forgiven little, you love little. Tell that.
Well, I think, isn't that in the context of
washing feet?
Yeah, washing feet. And so obviously this is a woman of questionable background. Here she is in the home of some very righteous, self-righteous people. Here's Jesus. And she starts washing Jesus's feet with her hair. And
with her tears.
Yeah, and with her tears and wiping his feet. And I mean, talk about a picture of humility. I mean, you have to be humbled by the hand of God to engage this way or to have this kind of a thing happen.
Well, and she went in front of, this was a wealthy home she was in. So, she's going in. How she even got in isn't really clear. But she goes in and she washes his feet with her tears. She's crying that much and is that grateful.
Yeah, and he basically looks to the guy who invited him and says, you know, this woman has been washing my feet with her hair and with her tears, and she basically has, she's loving much out of having nothing. And it was a real contrast to the guy who was like running the dinner, who was very self-righteous.
Well, and she was, you know, a woman of ill repute, so she knew, it was obvious how much she'd been forgiven.
You know, maybe in a whole conversation about forgiveness, the idea of self-righteousness is so wrapped up in our forgiveness that we believe that others don't deserve to be forgiven, but we do. And that goes back to the parable that you started with today that you read, because that man had no perspective on that. Here he could be forgiven millions, and then he could persecute over thousands, and it was irrelevant because of what was inside of his heart. Huh. Interesting. A lot of stuff in this post. The principles for the power of forgiveness. These are things that you can check out. A gentle answer turns away wrath. We've seen that time and time again. And when there's no gentle answer, then it complicates things, and it brings
a harsh retort.
It brings about wrath. So that's one thing to look for when, because again, that will be a strategy of the enemy. He'll try to bring that into, because he doesn't want forgiveness to happen.
He wants to keep it all roiled
Because he
up.
doesn't want people to be free. And then there's a proverb, Proverbs 25, that talks about heaping burning embers upon another person's head. And I'm still wrestling with that and thinking about, well,
is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I think it is a good thing, but I don't know that it's a pleasant thing.
Oh, yeah,
you know what
true.
I mean? So that's something to maybe check out and understand yourself. Jesus in Matthew 5 talks about, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. He talks about turning the other cheek in Luke 6. All of these things are wrapped up. And what you're going to find is that the teaching on forgiveness is woven all the way through the teachings of Jesus, because it was so necessary. It was so necessary for our God to explain forgiveness to us. Not just because we need it with each other, but we need to understand it from a God perspective, and God forgiving us, and just what that cost him to do that kind of forgiveness. Yeah, so interesting things. There's a lot of things to talk about here, but I suppose we could stop that. What do you, if you're going to leave people with one thing, from the whole conversation about forgiveness, what would it be?
It's imperative. It's a command, and it changes your life, and it brings freedom instead of bondage. And if you don't do it, you will be tortured. And I just tortured in heart, tortured in emotion. You might not call it torture, but you're not free. And that's probably more than you wanted, but...
No, that's what I wanted. And you reminded me that if when it comes to really understanding how important this was to Jesus, I'm sure there's a lot of people listening right now that know the Lord's Prayer. Go look at it today and see how it reflects on this core thread of what Jesus is teaching in order for us to be free. If you have any questions, you can reach out to us at 4 at fourthstream.com. We're in the fight. We're in the fight with you, and we are talking about what it means to war in the Spirit.